They say a man spends his whole life building a career brick by brick, building a home plank by nail, building a family memory by shared laugh. And sometimes you wake up one morning and the whole darn structure, every single piece, lies shattered around you, dust and splinters. It's in those quiet moments when the echo of the crash finally fades that a man truly finds out what he's made of. Finds out if he's got anything left to build with, or if he's just another pile of rubble himself. Eugene was one of those men. 48 years old, the kind of age where the creases around your eyes tell a story deeper than any photograph could, especially now. He'd spent most of his adult life inside the loud, rhythmic gut of a manufacturing plant, the kind of place that smells of hot metal and honest sweat, a smell that had long since clung to his clothes, and some might say to his very skin. You could see the years of it on him, not just in the faint, silvery scar above his left eyebrow from a stray bolt back in '08, or the way his shoulders, once broad and solid with the easy strength of a man who provided, now carried a subtle, almost perpetual slump. It was like he was trying to make himself smaller, trying to disappear into the background of a world that had grown too loud, too sharp. His hands, though, those hands were a different testament entirely. Calloused, the knuckles thick and slightly gnarled from 1,000 shifts, the kind of hands that had known the reassuring heft of a wrench, the rough grain of wood when he'd fixed something around the house, the delicate, irreplaceable softness of a child's cheek pressed against his. They were strong, still, capable, but you noticed the fine, almost imperceptible tremor that sometimes ran through them when he was still, when his mind wandered too close to the edge of things he refused to name. They were the hands of a man who built, a man whose identity was tied to the things he could fix and create, and then, for a long stretch, had found himself with nothing left to build with, no purpose for their strength beyond the basic necessities of getting by. For a long time after the silence fell, a silence that had permeated every corner of his existence, Eugene carried himself like a ghost walking through a world of the living. His eyes, once quick to crinkle at the corners in a genuine, easy smile, or soften with pure, unadulterated love at the sight of his kids, had become distant, the color of a cloudy winter sky, opaque and watchful. He'd lost a good 20 pounds, the kind of weight that strips a man down to sinew and bone, leaving him looking gaunt, hollowed out, like an old tree struck by lightning from the inside. His hair, what was left of it, was a salt and pepper mess he rarely bothered to comb, a perpetual bedhead that spoke of deeper dishevelment than just his morning routine. It was the look of a man who had gone through a war, a private, brutal war fought in the quiet chambers of his own heart, and barely made it out alive. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if each step required conscious effort, each breath a difficult decision. His withdrawal wasn't anger or disdain. It was a profound, almost physical inability to engage, a protective shell around a core of excruciating pain. When he spoke, which wasn't often, his voice was a low rumble, worn thin, like river stones smoothed by years of unrelenting current. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer unsolicited opinions. He just watched, observed, his gaze surprisingly sharp and empathetic when it landed on something or someone struggling. A quiet observer, processing, understanding a world that had, for a time, moved on without him. He was a man who listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, you knew it meant something. But if you looked close, real close, especially when the light caught him just right, or when he was focused on some mundane, almost meditative task, stacking cans on a shelf at the grocery, watching a pigeon peck at crumbs in the park, meticulously folding a worn shirt, you might catch it. A flicker. Not joy, not yet, not even hope exactly, more like a stubborn refusal to fully give in. A quiet, almost defiant spark in those tired eyes that seemed to whisper, "I'm still here." It was the mark of a man who had been through the fire, seen everything he held dear turn to ashes, but somehow, someway hadn't truly broken, not completely. He was a man holding on, not to a memory, but to the next breath. And maybe, just maybe, that quiet, steady intake of air, that stubborn insistence on being present was enough. Enough to start building again, even if he didn't know what shape the new structure would take. They say a man spends his life building things. Not just physical structures, mind you, though Eugene knew a thing or two about those too. No, he builds a family, brick by brick, laughter by shared laughter, secret by whispered secret, the quiet certainty of familiar voices. He builds a home, beam by beam, memory by memory, the scent of dinner lingering in the air, the scuff marks on the floor a testament to lives lived fully within those walls. He builds a career, sweat by sweat, ambition by ambition, trading hours for security, calluses for comfort, for the steady promise of a paycheck. And sometimes, if he's lucky, he builds a quiet certainty that the sun will rise, the bills will get paid, and the people he loves will be there waiting when he walks through the door, ready to fill the silence with the sound of their lives. That certainty, that quiet hum of predictability, it becomes the bedrock of everything. But what happens, you ever wonder, when all those things, the bricks, the beams, the sweat, the certainty, the very bedrock itself, what happens when they all just vanish? Not slowly like a gentle erosion, but suddenly, violently, like a house hit by a freight train. When the whole damn structure comes crashing down, leaving nothing but dust and the deafening echo of what was. When the silence is no longer filled with laughter, but with a hollow ache that vibrates in your very bones. Some men, they just crumble with it, reduced to rubble themselves, their will to move dissolving into the debris. Some, they turn to stone, their hearts hardening against the impossible weight of it all, refusing to feel another thing. And then there are the rare few, the ones who stand amidst the smoking ruins, breathe in the dust and ash, and realize that perhaps, just perhaps, when you lose everything you thought you owned, you actually own the only thing that truly matters, the next breath. And what you do with it, that's where the true building begins. Not of homes or families or careers, but of a self that can endure, a self that can choose to live. That's where Eugene found himself, a man trying to figure out what to do with that next breath, how to mold it into something, anything, after the demolition. His name was Eugene. He was 48 years old, though the mirror in his small, sparsely furnished, rented room reflected a man who'd seen a lifetime, maybe two, in those years. Every wrinkle around his eyes, every deep line etched from his nose to the corners of his mouth, told a story not of joy or laughter, but of quiet endurance, of burdens carried in silence, of relentless gravity. He still carried the sturdy frame of a factory worker, a man built for repetition and heavy lifting, for standing on concrete floors all day, every day. There was a raw-boned strength to him, a kind of unyielding physicality that spoke of years spent turning wrenches and muscling heavy parts onto assembly lines, of pushing through aches and pains until the job was done. But the usual grease and grime of the plant, the faint metallic tang that used to cling to his skin and clothes like a second scent, it was gone now. Replaced by the almost clinical smell of cheap detergent on his worn shirts, a smell that felt foreign, sterile on him, like a bandage on an old wound. His eyes, the color of old pavement after a long rain, were recessed deep under heavy lids that seemed perpetually tired, weighted down by an unseen force. They didn't miss much, though. They held a quiet watchfulness, a gaze that seemed to take everything in, analyze it, but reveal very little in return. They were the eyes of a man who had seen too much, suffered too much to be easily surprised or fooled, yet they held no malice, only a profound weariness. But even through that heavy veil of exhaustion and grief, as the light would catch them just so you might still glimpse it, that stubborn, almost defiant spark, a tiny, flickering ember that refused to fully extinguish, that whispered, "I'm still here. I'm still here," got him it. His hands. Those hands were the story of his life, laid out for anyone who cared to look. Calloused, scarred, the knuckles thick and gnarled from countless impacts and years of repetitive strain. His fingernails, always cut short and clean, had once been perpetually rimmed with the fine dust of metal shavings or the faint scent of machine oil. These were the hands that had fed machines for decades, yes, but also the hands that had changed countless diapers, patiently helped a daughter learn to tie her shoes, fixed leaky faucets under the kitchen sink, and gently smoothed the hair back from a sleeping son's brow. They used to be the hands of a provider, a protector, always busy, always purposeful, always building something. Now they were just hands. Often clasped together or tucked into his pockets, as if seeking warmth or perhaps just a purpose they hadn't quite rediscovered yet. They moved slowly, deliberately, as if each gesture was a conscious effort, a careful expenditure of energy, the precise opposite of the hurried, automatic movements of his past. He was a man worn smooth by the relentless currents of life, stripped bare of everything but that quiet, insistent pulse that still beat within him. The world Eugene knew, the one that had shaped those hands, had been a tight, predictable orbit around the sun of routine. 5 o'clock in the morning, the alarm a rasping cough in the pre-dawn dark, pulling him from sleep like a heavy anchor being dragged from mud. Not 5:01, not 5:03, but 5 o'clock sharp. Always. Because 5 o'clock meant just enough time for a quick shower, a slice of toast standing at the counter, and a thermos of lukewarm coffee before the long drive to the plant. The plant, a monument to sameness, a cathedral of steel and ceaseless noise. For 30 years, he'd walked through those gates, the air thick with the metallic tang of industry and the low hum of distant machinery that vibrated in your bones even when you weren't touching it. His station was at the press, a behemoth that stamped out parts with a rhythmic, concussive thump-hiss, thump-hiss. Hour after hour, day after day, year after year, his job was to feed it, watch it, clean it. His brain could have been turned off. His body, his hands, knew the dance by heart. Lift, slide, press the button. Repeat, 100 times an hour, 800 times a day, 200,000 times a year. It wasn't glorious work, wasn't work you talked about over Sunday dinner with any real enthusiasm, but it was reliable. It paid the bills. It kept the roof over their heads, the lights on, and Sarah's small garden blooming in the backyard. Every paycheck was a tightrope walk. There was always enough, just barely. Enough for the mortgage, the car payment, the ever-rising cost of groceries that seemed to mock the steady, unchanging number on his pay stub. Enough for Emily's art supplies, for Josh's new soccer cleats. Always a juggling act, a constant mental tally of what could be delayed, what couldn't. A broken furnace, an unexpected dental bill, those were the quiet terrors that kept him awake some nights, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house creak around him. He wasn't living to save for a yacht. He was living to keep his head above water, to provide the simple, good life for his family that he believed they deserved. And in that, he found his purpose, his quiet strength. But even through the grind, even with the satisfaction of keeping it all together, there were other things, deeper things, that sometimes stirred in the quiet hours. When the kids were finally asleep, when Sarah was absorbed in a book, when the house was finally still. He'd sit in his worn armchair, the TV a muted glow in the corner, and a strange, hollow ache would sometimes settle in his chest. He'd always had a knack for working with wood, for shaping raw timber into something beautiful and useful. There was a time long ago when he dreamed of opening his own small shop, the smell of sawdust and varnish instead of machine oil, the satisfaction of seeing a design come to life under his own hand, not just pressing a button on a machine someone else designed. He'd even built a sturdy workbench in the garage once, bought a set of decent chisels. For a while, he'd spent weekends out there humming to himself, shaping small, intricate boxes, a rocking horse for Emily, a wooden truck for Josh. But then life happened. Overtime at the plant, kids' activities, the sheer exhaustion that settled in after 60 hours on the factory floor. The workbench slowly became a repository for old tools, forgotten projects, eventually buried under boxes of forgotten Christmas decorations. The dreams faded, became quiet whispers he occasionally heard in the back of his mind, like old songs from a radio station that no longer broadcast. They weren't regrets, not exactly. More like ghosts of possibilities, paths not taken, parts of himself he gently, painstakingly put away for safekeeping, telling himself someday. Someday when the kids were grown, someday when the mortgage was paid, someday when he had more time, more energy, more himself to give. That someday never came. Instead, the someday became today, and today he had none of it. He had no dreams because he had no future to dream for. He had no himself left to give. He was just the man who used to be Eugene, a quiet, reliable man, defined by what he provided, not by who he was. When the providing was gone, so too, it seemed, was the man. That was the real, brutal truth that gnawed at him, even more than the gnawing emptiness of his stomach. The gnawing emptiness was more than just a feeling. It became a living thing inside him, a cold presence that settled deep in his chest the day the phone rang, a police officer's voice, calm and detached, speaking words that broke the world into pieces too small to ever put back together. Sarah, Emily, Josh, gone, a slick patch of road. A distracted driver, a moment, just one moment that erased everything. For weeks, Eugene walked through a fog. The funeral was a blur of black suits and hushed voices. He remembered the weight of the caskets, the feel of the rough earth on his hands as he tossed a handful into the grave. After that, the house was too big, too quiet. Every toy, every photograph, every half-finished drawing on the fridge became a spike driven into his heart. He tried to go back to the factory. The clang of metal, the drone of machinery, it was supposed to be a distraction. But every swing of the robotic arm, every whir of the conveyor belt just echoed the emptiness. He'd stare at his hands, calloused and strong, the same hands that had held Emily's tiny hand that had helped Josh build a fort out of sofa cushions. Now they just pushed buttons. They just tightened bolts. They were useless. Then came the other blows, not as shattering as the first, but each one landing with a precise, chilling impact. The notice taped to the main gate, plant closure, operation ceasing in 60 days. It was coming for months, whispers in the break room, rumors of dwindling orders, shifts being cut. But seeing it in black and white, stapled to the same gate he'd walked through for 25 years, it was a concrete wall slamming down on the path he thought he had left. His job, the one thing that still tethered him to a semblance of routine, to the act of providing, even if there was no one left to provide for, was gone too. He tried to find another job. He filled out applications with hands that felt clumsy and unsure. Factory experience, the forms asked. Specialized skills. He just stared at the blank lines. What skills did he have, really? He was a cog, a reliable, silent cog. Younger guys fresh out of trade school with their computer literacy and certifications, they got the calls. He got the polite, "We'll keep your application on file." The bills, those relentless monsters, kept coming. Electricity, gas, property tax. They piled up on the kitchen counter, ignored for days, then weeks. The red notices started arriving, final warnings, and finally the last one, a crisp white envelope with the bank's logo. Notice of foreclosure, the house. The house that Sarah had painted the kitchen yellow in, the one where Emily had etched her height marks on the doorframe, where Josh had hammered his first nail into a birdhouse, crooked but proud. It was too much. Not because he needed the roof over his head anymore, not truly. He could sleep in his truck, he sometimes thought, but because it was the last anchor. The last physical proof that they had ever existed, that he had ever been a husband, a father, a man with a life filled with crayon drawings and laughter. The day they came to change the locks, he was already gone. He'd spent the previous night in the empty rooms. Not an empty house, not anymore. Just a house stripped bare. The furniture gone, sold for pennies to cover what little debt he could, or taken by the bank. The walls echoed with silence. The dust motes danced in the slivers of weak sunlight filtering through the grimy windows like tiny, lost spirits. He walked from room to room, his footsteps hollow against the bare floorboards. The kitchen where Sarah had hummed while cooking. The living room where they'd watched movies, curled on the sofa. The kids' rooms, still faintly smelling of pencil shavings and forgotten dreams. He didn't cry. The tears had run dry months ago, replaced by a dull ache that never truly subsided. He just stood there, a solitary figure in a tomb of memories. He didn't know what time it was when he finally lowered himself onto the cold, hard floor of what used to be his living room. The streetlights outside cast long, skeletal shadows through the empty window frames. The only sound was the groan of the old house settling and the frantic, hollow beat of his own heart. 3 a.m., the loneliest hour. There was no bed, no chair, no warmth. Just the hard floorboards, the silence, and the ghosts. He thought about the rope he'd seen in the garage, a sturdy length for tying down lumber. He thought about the painkillers in the medicine cabinet, not many, but maybe enough if he washed them down with a half-empty bottle of cheap whiskey he'd found tucked away. The thoughts were not urgent, not desperate. They were just options. Logical conclusions to a life that had nowhere else to go. He felt nothing, not even fear. He just felt. Empty, a container cracked and drained, sitting in the dark. He looked at his hands again, illuminated by a pale shaft of moonlight. What had they done with their 48 years? Worked, provided, loved, and now they were useless. He was useless. He was less than useless. He was a burden on the earth, drawing breath, taking up space, consuming oxygen, and contributing nothing. There was no legacy, no purpose. No one to remember him. His family was gone. His job was gone. His home was gone. His very identity, the quiet man who provided, was gone. He was a shadow, a whisper of a man who used to be. The brutal truth settled on him like a shroud. He was already dead, he just hadn't stopped breathing yet. The air in the empty house felt heavy, thick with unspoken grief, with the echoes of a life that no longer existed. He lay there, flat on his back, staring up at the dark, water-stained ceiling. Every breath was an effort, a pointless act. What was the point? Why bother? There was no answer, just the silence, just the cold, just the overwhelming, crushing weight of having nothing left. The cold seeped into his bones, a mirror to the emptiness inside. He lay there still for what felt like hours, maybe an eternity. The moon climbed higher, then began its descent, pulling a faint, gray light through the grimy window panes. And with that light, something shifted. Not a big roar, not a burst of revelation, but a quiet, almost imperceptible tremor. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was something far more primal. It was enough. Enough of the dark, enough of the cold, enough of the silence that wasn't peaceful but suffocating. Enough of waiting to die, or worse, just fading away. He'd lost everything that had defined him. Every anchor ripped away. His family, his job, his home. He had nothing left to lose. And in that terrifying, desolate clarity, a strange, stark truth emerged. If he had nothing to lose, then maybe, just maybe, he had everything to gain. Not happiness, not a return to what was, but simply a choice. To breathe, to stand, to take the next step even if he didn't know where the hell he was going. The thought didn't bring comfort, it brought a sudden, surprising nausea. The sheer weight of choosing to live when every fiber of his being screamed for oblivion was immense. But the alternative, lying here until he simply ceased, felt even heavier. So slowly, painfully, Eugene pushed himself up. His muscles screamed in protest, stiff and cold. The floorboards groaned under his weight. He stood in the middle of the empty living room, a ghost in his own house, and for the first time in weeks, he didn't just exist. He decided. The decision made, the first steps were a brutal testament to its difficulty. Day 1. The sun was up, but it felt like the world was still 1,000 miles away. He had to get out. The house was being repossessed tomorrow. The moving truck had taken the last few boxes of what remained of his life, mostly tools he couldn't bear to part with, packed tight in the back of a borrowed truck, now sitting at the small, rented room across town. He had to get to that room. Every movement was an act of monumental will. His body felt heavy, alien. He stumbled out the back door, the familiar squeak of the hinges a knife to his memory. The backyard was overgrown, a jungle of weeds where Sarah used to tend her small rose garden. The swing set where Emily and Josh had spent countless summer afternoons stood rusted and forlorn. He didn't look at them. He couldn't. He just kept moving, one foot in front of the other, through the patchy grass, down the driveway, and out to the street. The walk to the bus stop was a blur. His eyes, accustomed to the dimness of the empty house, squinted against the morning light. The world felt too bright, too loud, too vibrant for someone who felt so utterly drained. Cars rushed past, people hurried on sidewalks, coffee cups in hand, their lives unfolding around him with a frantic energy he no longer understood. He felt like an alien observer, a ghost watching the living. The bus arrived, its brakes hissing, and he climbed aboard, paying with crumpled bills from his pocket, some of the last money he had. The small room he'd rented was barely more than a closet. A single bed, a cheap dresser, a tiny window looking out onto a brick wall. His boxes were stacked neatly in the corner, a sad monument to a life dismantled. He stood there, staring at them, the silence of this new place almost as heavy as the old. The urge to crawl into bed, to pull the thin blanket over his head and simply disappear was overwhelming. It was a physical ache, a craving for oblivion. But then he remembered the lesson of the long night. Nothing left to lose. He had chosen to live, not just exist. And living, he realized, wasn't about grand gestures or immediate happiness. It was about the next breath. It was about what he did with that breath. So he didn't lie down. Instead, he walked over to the boxes. His hands, still stained with the grease and grime of the factory, reached for the top one. It was heavy, marked, "Tools Eugene." He hesitated, then pulled it open. Inside, nestled among old rags, lay his hammer, his saw, his chisels, his old friends. He picked up a block plane, running his thumb over the smooth, worn wood. It was real. It was tangible. It was something he could do something with. He didn't know what he was going to build, or for whom, or why, but the feel of the wood, the weight of the tools, was a small, steady anchor in the churning sea of his grief. He knew it wouldn't be easy. He knew the demons would claw at him, whisper doubts, try to drag him back into the dark. But for this one moment in this small, lonely room, he had made a choice, and he had taken the first agonizing step. He had decided to start living. The first day, living. Looked a lot like just moving things around. He picked up the block plane, the familiar weight a small comfort, and shaved off a curl of pine from a piece of scrap wood he'd found tucked away in the bottom of the box. The smell, clean and sharp like a forgotten memory, cut through the mustiness of the rented room. It was something. Not much, but something. He did that for an hour, just shaving wood, watching the thin curls fall to the floor like tiny, pale ribbons, each one a testament to a moment he was present, not lost. Day 2, the silence screamed. The thin walls of his new room felt too close, too empty, the sounds from outside, a distant siren, a neighbor's television, too intrusive, yet he felt utterly, terrifyingly alone. The stack of tools, still not fully unpacked, sat accusingly. "What's the point, Eugene?" A voice whispered, sounding too much like his own, but laced with a cruel despair. "Who are you building for now? Who's going to tell you it's a good job? Sarah? Emily? Josh?" He found himself staring at the bare wall, hours melting away into a gray blur. His stomach rumbled, a dull ache, but the effort to get up, to boil water for the instant coffee that tasted like regret, felt like scaling a sheer cliff face. He almost didn't. Almost just stayed there, letting the heavy quiet swallow him whole, letting the inertia drag him back into the abyss he'd promised himself he'd left. But then he remembered the plane, the pine shavings, the simple, undeniable act of it. the faint scent still lingering on his fingers. He stood up slowly, his knees protesting, his back stiff. He forced himself to pick a chisel, a small one, cool and heavy in his palm. He'd seen a broken chair leg someone had left by the dumpster that morning, brought it back, and now he started to carefully clean the rough, splintered edges with the chisel's sharp blade. The focused movement was a shield, thin and imperfect, but present, deflecting the relentless assault of his thoughts. The following week was a brutal fight, every single hour a conscious choice, a war waged within the confines of that small room. He woke each morning with the same crushing weight on his chest, a concrete slab of grief pressing down, the same pervasive temptation to just pull the blanket over his head and let the day, and his fragile resolve dissolve. Memories ambushed him at every turn, Sarah's gentle touch as he walked in the door, Emily's crooked drawings still clear in his mind, Josh's insistent questions about how things worked, the very questions that had once filled his days with purpose. Each memory was a fresh cut, tearing at the new, tender skin he was trying to grow, and sometimes he'd just drop the tools, his hands shaking, and sit on the floor, letting the wave of grief crash over him, suffocating him. He often thought he couldn't breathe, that the air itself had become too heavy to draw into his lungs. One afternoon, in a desperate attempt to create something tangible, something that might prove he still could, he tried to fashion a small box, something simple, practical, perhaps for storing screws. He measured, he cut, he planed with an intensity bordering on desperation. But his mind was a fractured landscape, lost in the ghost of his old kitchen, the echoes of laughter that once filled it, now a hollow ache. His focus wavered. He misjudged a cut, the saw screeching as it veered, splintering the carefully selected piece of wood. A surge of pure, unadulterated rage, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to feel in months, erupted from deep within him. He hurled the ruined piece against the far wall, the dull thud echoing in the empty space. "What's the damn point?" He yelled, his voice raw, cracking, unfamiliar to his own ears. He picked up the hammer, its head glinting menacingly, wanting to smash everything, to just destroy, because destruction felt infinitely easier, more immediate than the painstaking, agonizing process of building. He stood there, hammer raised high above his head, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. The old Eugene, the quiet, dependable Eugene, was gone, evaporated in the fumes of his loss. This new Eugene, forged in the crucible of absolute devastation, was teetering on a precipice, staring into an abyss. The image of the empty house, the finality of it all, flashed before him, stark and unforgiving. He remembered the feeling of having nothing left to lose, that chilling freedom he'd found on that final night. And for a wild, desperate moment, he thought, maybe losing it all means I can finally lose myself too. Just let go, just stop fighting. But then his gaze fell slowly from the ceiling to his trembling hand gripping the hammer. It was a tool for building, for shaping, for creating, not for mindless destruction, not for tearing down the last, fragile sliver of himself he had managed to salvage from the wreckage. The white-hot anger began to recede, draining away and leaving behind an even deeper, soul-wearying exhaustion. He lowered the hammer slowly, its weight a physical manifestation of his choice. He looked at the splintered wood on the floor, then at the other pieces he had carefully cut, awaiting assembly. He had failed this piece, yes, but he hadn't failed himself. Not yet, not entirely. He picked up a different piece of wood, a smaller scrap with a beautiful, intricate grain he hadn't noticed before, hidden beneath the rough surface. He took out a fine grit sandpaper, its abrasive surface surprisingly comforting, and began to rub slowly, steadily, back and forth. The resistance of the wood, the quiet whisper of the paper, the emerging smoothness beneath his thumb, it was a meditation, a small, tangible act of defiance against the chaos raging inside him. He worked until the pale light faded from the window, until his shoulders ached with a physical tiredness that was almost welcome, until the intricate grain of the wood was all he could see, all he could feel, anchoring him firmly in the present moment. It was not a victory, not in any grand sense. It was just survival. But survival, he was beginning to learn, was built one quiet, stubborn act at a time. It was the refusal to let the overwhelming darkness win, even when it felt like the only path left. It was taking the next breath, then the one after that, and putting something, anything, into motion. It was choosing to remain. Days bled into weeks, each one quietly marked by the rasp of sandpaper and the precise tap of a mallet. The small rented room, once a stark tomb of echoing loss, slowly began to hum with a different kind of life. Sawdust mingled with the stale air, a fine dust of creation. Eugene didn't just make things, he remade himself in the quiet discipline of the craft. He started with simple, practical pieces. A sturdy bookend for the old lady downstairs, a small, polished box for the young couple above. He didn't ask for payment, only for the raw wood, salvaged or donated. The act of shaping, of coaxing something useful and beautiful from a rough-hewn plank, began to realign the fractured pieces deep inside him. Each finished piece was a testament not just to skill, but to a quiet, stubborn refusal to yield. One morning, catching his reflection in the smudged window, a window he now instinctively cleaned, he noticed it. Not a wide, beaming smile, but something else. A flicker, a softening around the eyes that wasn't there before. Less like the haunted gaze of a man trapped in a storm, more like the steady watchfulness of someone who'd weathered it and found a quiet shore. He ran a hand over his stubbled chin, then a different kind of hand. Not the factory-scarred, oil-stained hand of before, but one etched with the fine lines of wood grain, smelling faintly of pine and beeswax. It was still a working man's hand, but it carried a different story. It wasn't just him who noticed. Mrs. Henderson, the old lady downstairs, who usually just nodded curtly, stopped him one afternoon as he carried a piece of salvaged oak. "Eugene," she said, her voice raspy, "that little box you made me, it holds my husband's old pocket watch. Feels right, like it's got a bit of heart in it." She didn't say more, just looked at him with an uncommon warmth, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Eugene didn't just nod and retreat. He paused. "Glad it helps, ma'am," he replied, his voice a little rusty but steady. "Heard you talking about his watch once, thought it deserved a good home. A tiny connection, a thread of shared humanity, woven not with words but with wood and quiet empathy. The young couple upstairs, always rushing, sometimes left him a mug of coffee on his doorstep. No note, just the steaming cup. He'd never had neighbors do anything like that before. He understood it wasn't pity, but a recognition, a silent acknowledgement of a shift, of a man finding his footing again. Eugene started venturing out more, not for grand adventures, but for simple walks, to the park where he used to take Emily and Josh, not to wallow, but to sit on a bench under the same old oak tree and just be. He watched children play, their laughter echoing, no longer a fresh stab of pain, but a quiet, bittersweet melody of life continuing. He'd pick up fallen leaves, marveling at the intricate veins, the subtle fade from green to gold. He saw details he'd been too busy, too burdened to notice before. The way light filtered through the dusty panes of an old storefront, the determined thrust of a dandelion through a crack in the pavement, the pattern of frost on a forgotten window pane. He started carrying a small notebook and a pencil, not to write grand prose, but to sketch these tiny observations. The knot in a piece of driftwood, the crooked smile of a homeless man he offered a sandwich to, the intense focus of a squirrel burying an acorn. He wasn't trying to capture beauty, he was just acknowledging its presence. He wasn't trying to escape his pain. He was just learning to coexist with it, to let it inform a deeper appreciation for the fragile, tenacious pulse of the world. The rage, the soul-crushing despair, it hadn't vanished completely. It was still there, a scar tissue deep within him, but it no longer consumed him. It had become a part of his story, not the whole of it. He understood now that grief wasn't a tunnel with an exit, but a companion that walked alongside you. And you could choose what kind of company you made of it. He still thought of Sarah, Emily, and Josh every single day. The memories were vivid, potent. But now they were less like anchors dragging him down, and more like distant stars, guiding him, reminding him of the profound love he'd known, a love that had shaped him even in its absence. He remembered Sarah's soft touch, Emily's infectious giggle, Josh's endless questions. And he found himself not just mourning their loss, but quietly celebrating that they had existed, that he had been lucky enough to be part of their brief, beautiful lives. One crisp autumn morning, as the sun painted the rented room in warm, golden hues, Eugene was sanding a small wooden boat, a gift for a boy he'd seen playing alone in the park. His movements were fluid, precise. He wasn't just working wood, he was breathing life into it. He paused, feeling the smooth, cool grain under his thumb, the subtle vibration of the sanding block. He looked around the room, no longer seeing emptiness but simple tools, stacks of salvaged wood, and the quiet testament of things built. He thought of his old life, the factory, the routines, the house that was once so full, now gone. All the things he'd built, accumulated, relied upon. And then all of it taken away. He remembered the feeling of sitting in that empty house, the last echo of his family gone, believing he had nothing left. That was the moment he had truly died, almost. But that wasn't right. That was the moment he had chosen to live. He understood now. You spend your whole life building things, a career, a home, a family. You lay down roots, gather possessions, mark your place in the world. And then sometimes in a single devastating moment or a slow, grinding decline, it's all stripped away. The foundations crumble, the walls come down, and you're left with nothing but yourself. And that's when you learn. You can either lay down and let the dust settle over you, become another forgotten stone in the rubble, or you can stand up. You can look around at the wreckage and realize that the only thing you truly own, the only thing that can never be taken from you, is the next breath, and what you choose to do with it. That breath, that moment, that quiet, stubborn decision to put one foot in front of the other, to create, to connect, to simply be in the world, scars and all. That's living. Eugene picked up his sanding block again, the rhythmic rasp a steady heartbeat in the quiet room. He wasn't searching for happiness. He was searching for meaning and finding it in the dust, in the grain, in the small, unwavering acts of building anew. He wasn't a father, a husband, a factory man anymore. He was simply Eugene, and that was enough. There was a man once lost in the ruins of his